announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
For 18 months, nothing happened. No alarms, no headlines, no warnings on international channels, just quiet charts, silent routes, and a handful of submariners who believed they were about to change how power was perceived in the Caribbean. This story does not begin with an explosion. It begins with confidence. Colombia had studied the sea carefully. Shipping lanes, patrol rhythms, the habits of carrier groups that seemed predictable after years of observation. Analysts believed patterns were stable. Commanders believed discipline and silence could still bend the balance. And the submarines, modern, quiet, and crewed by professionals, slipped beneath the surface believing they were unseen. They were wrong. What no one aboard those submarines knew was that the operation had effectively ended before it began. Not because of a single detection, not because of a dramatic sonar ping or a sudden scramble of aircraft, but because modern naval warfare no longer works that way. There is no moment of discovery. There is only a process. Every decision the crews made, speed changes, depth choices, battery management, radio discipline, was quietly feeding a system they could not see. Short transmissions, slight deviations forced by geography, the necessity to conserve power. Each small compromise narrowed the number of possible futures. Above the surface, nothing appeared to change. Ships held course. Aircraft followed routine patrols. No warnings were issued. No maneuvers signaled concern. To an outside observer, the sea looked indifferent. But beneath that calm surface, probability was doing its work. Modern navies do not hunt submarines the way they once did. They do not rush to engage. They wait. They model. They allow movement, not out of ignorance, but out of confidence. The ocean itself becomes a constraint. Depth limits, thermal layers, coastlines, traffic density, time. Every hour underwater costs energy. Every choice removes alternatives. By the time the Colombian crews began to feel pressure, it was already too late to change the outcome. The realization did not arrive as panic. It arrived as hesitation. When every option feels dangerous, freedom has already been lost. Battery levels dropped faster than expected. Environmental systems demanded power. Information arrived faster than it could be processed. The crews were not overwhelmed by fear, but by certainty. The certainty that someone else understood the situation better than they did. No shots were fired. No orders were shouted. There was no dramatic confrontation. One by one, the submarines surfaced. Not because they were forced by weapons, but because the sea had quietly removed every other option. What followed was calm, professional, and restrained. International law observed. Distance maintained. Control demonstrated without escalation. The message was unmistakable. Dominance no longer requires destruction. This is not a story about Colombian submarines failing. It is a story about a world that has changed. In modern naval warfare, stealth is no longer invisibility. Power is no longer measured in firepower alone. Victory is often decided long before anyone realizes a contest has begun. And the most dangerous moment is not when the first weapon is launched, but when one side finally understands that the decision was already made. The operation began quietly, long before any submarine left port. In briefing rooms where maps of the Caribbean Sea were covered with transparent overlays, showing shipping density, seabed contours, and historical patrol patterns. For Colombia, the objective was not confrontation, but presence. A controlled demonstration that its navy could operate undetected in waters traditionally dominated by larger powers. The planners believed the moment was right. Regional traffic had increased, commercial noise cluttered acoustic conditions, and seasonal temperature layers created favorable sound propagation gaps. On paper, the environment seemed to reward patience and discipline. Over the previous year and a half, analysts within the Colombian Navy had compiled what they considered a reliable behavioral model of U.S. surface forces. Carrier strike groups transited predictable corridors. Patrol aircraft favored efficiency over randomness. Exercises followed schedules that, while classified, left subtle signatures visible to those who watched long enough. This was not espionage in the cinematic sense. no stolen plans or dramatic leaks, but a slow accumulation of open-source data, satellite imagery, maritime traffic records, and acoustic samples gathered during routine training cruises. Confidence grew not from a single insight, but from repetition. When the submarines finally deployed, their departure was deliberately unremarkable. No ceremonies, no press coverage. The boats slipped into the water at night, officially logged as extended training missions. Their crews were among the most experienced in the fleet, selected not for aggression, but for restraint. Every man aboard understood that the success of the mission depended less on boldness than on refusing temptation, resisting the urge to gather extra data, to close distance too quickly, or to transmit unnecessary reports. Silence was treated as a weapon. The initial phase unfolded exactly as planned. Once submerged, the submarines adopted conservative speeds, staying within battery-efficient envelopes while using known thermal layers to mask their movement. They avoided direct approaches to high-value units, instead positioning themselves along what planners believed were statistically inevitable transit routes. From inside the hulls, the ocean felt vast and forgiving. Passive sonar returns blended naturally into background noise. There were no sudden contacts, no signs of pursuit. To the crews, this absence of reaction confirmed their assumptions. They were inside the blind spot. What the planners did not fully account for was how little visible reaction mattered. The absence of surface activity was interpreted as ignorance rather than restraint. In reality, nothing about the environment was neutral. Each stretch of water chosen, each hour spent holding position, subtly constrained future options. Geography narrowed choices in ways that charts could not fully convey. Deep water gave way to shelves. Traffic lanes forced compromises in depth. Even ideal sound conditions demanded trade-offs in speed and endurance. Above the surface, forces of the US Navy continued their routines with almost theatrical normalcy. Ships held steady courses. Aircraft flew patterns that looked identical to dozens of previous patrols. There was no sudden tightening of formations, no visible shift to a defensive posture. To any observer, it appeared that nothing had changed. This apparent indifference reinforced Colombian confidence, encouraging the belief that their analysis had been correct. Yet from the very first hours, the deployment had already entered a monitored space, not defined by exact positions, but by probabilities. Time itself became a factor. Every hour submerged consumed energy. Every decision to wait eliminated alternatives. The crews believed they were advancing into opportunity, unaware that the framework of the encounter was already taking shape around them. In modern naval operations, the opening move is often invisible, and the side that feels most comfortable is not always the one in control. Within Colombian Naval Command, expectations were shaped less by ambition than by a belief that the environment itself could be predicted. Senior officers in the Colombian Navy did not imagine overwhelming US forces or forcing a confrontation. Instead, they believed that careful behavior inside a complex maritime system would grant them temporary initiative. Their confidence rested on the assumption that modern navies, no matter how advanced, still relied on habits, patterns of movement, logistical efficiency, and institutional preference for stability over surprise. Over months of internal analysis, Colombian planners convinced themselves that carrier strike groups operated within narrower margins than publicly acknowledged. The logic was straightforward. Large formations consumed fuel, required predictable replenishment cycles, and favored transit routes that minimized political friction and navigational risk. Historical data suggested that deviations from these routes were rare outside of major exercises. Even then, the deviations followed familiar templates. From the Colombian perspective, this predictability was not a weakness of the US Navy, but a structural necessity, one that smaller forces could exploit through patience. Another expectation centered on doctrine. Colombian analysts believed that the US Navy prioritized deterrence through visibility. Carrier groups were meant to be seen, aircraft were meant to signal presence, and patrols were designed to reassure allies rather than confuse observers. This belief led to a critical assumption that American forces would respond to perceived threats through overt posture changes rather than quiet observation. In Colombian war games, detection was expected to trigger action, maneuvers, warnings, or increased patrol density. Silence, in their models, meant success. This assumption extended to technology as well. While Colombian planners respected U.S. sensor capabilities, they believed those systems were optimized for high-confidence detections rather than ambiguous signals. Low-probability contacts, intermittent acoustic traces, and behavior that mimicked commercial traffic were assumed to fall below the threshold of concern. Several internal assessments suggested that U.S. commanders, wary of escalation and false positives, would avoid committing resources unless detection was clear and persistent. This belief reinforced the idea that disciplined submarines could operate in a gray zone without provoking a response. There was also a political dimension shaping expectations. Colombian leadership viewed the operation as a message rather than a maneuver. A quiet demonstration of reach would strengthen Colombia's position in regional security discussions without forcing public confrontation. The hope was that success would remain unofficial but understood, noticed by professionals, discussed quietly in briefings, and factored into future planning. In this context, remaining undetected was not merely tactical, it was strategic. Detection without escalation was seen as unlikely, almost contradictory. Some of these assumptions were grounded in reality. Large naval forces do rely on logistics. Predictability does exist. Escalation management is a genuine concern for major powers. But Colombian planners overestimated how much of modern naval behavior is reactive rather than anticipatory. They imagined detection as an event, not a continuum. Internal simulations treated the ocean as a static environment, rather than a dynamic filter that constantly shapes probability. In doing so, they framed the problem in terms of avoidance rather than exposure. A particularly influential briefing circulated weeks before deployment claimed that advances in submarine quieting had outpaced improvements in wide-area tracking. The document cited selective studies, some outdated, suggesting diminishing returns in passive sonar coverage in busy maritime regions. While the conclusions were debated, they aligned conveniently with existing beliefs. The result was a consensus that time favored the submarines, that the longer they operated without incident, the safer they became. What this mindset obscured was a subtle shift in how power was exercised at sea. Control no longer required immediate response. Observation did not demand interruption. Allowing an adversary to move was not a concession, but a method of learning. The Colombian plan assumed that initiative belonged to whoever acted first. In reality, initiative increasingly belonged to whoever understood the system better. By the time the submarines were underway, Colombian command believed the hardest part was already behind them. Routes were chosen, risks were calculated, expectations were set. From their perspective, the operation was unfolding within acceptable margins. What they did not yet grasp was that these margins had been defined using an outdated understanding of how modern naval forces perceive time, information, and advantage. The turning point of the operation was not marked by a single mistake, but by a misunderstanding so fundamental that it shaped every subsequent decision. As mentioned earlier, Colombian planners viewed detection as a discrete event, something that either happened or did not. What they failed to recognize was that modern maritime surveillance treats uncertainty as usable data. In this environment, incomplete information is not discarded. It is accumulated, weighted, and refined over time. The absence of a clear signal does not imply safety. It simply means the picture is still forming. From the perspective of the U.S. Navy, the early indicators did not justify confrontation, but they were sufficient to trigger quiet adjustments within an already existing framework. Slight anomalies in acoustic background levels, timing irregularities in commercial traffic patterns, and subtle shifts in underwater noise profiles were flagged not as threats, but as variables. None of these indicators pointed to a precise location. They did not need to. Their value lay in correlation. When layered against geography and known operational constraints, they reduced uncertainty just enough to shape expectations. Rather than attempting to localize the submarines directly, U.S. analysts focused on eliminating impossibilities. Certain routes were deprioritized due to depth limitations. Others were statistically unlikely due to energy requirements or traffic density. This process was iterative and deliberately slow. By allowing time to pass, the system forced the submarines to make decisions. Every hour underwater narrowed their future options, regardless of whether they realized it. The ocean was no longer a hiding place. It had become a filter. Surface forces continued to behave normally, a choice that was both intentional and calculated. There were no aggressive maneuvers because aggression would have introduced noise, political, operational, and informational. Instead, patrol aircraft subtly altered flight timing, not routes. Ships adjusted speeds within standard deviations that appeared insignificant to any external observer. These changes were designed to test reactions, not provoke them. The absence of response from below the surface was itself informative. What made this phase particularly effective was the integration of modeling with observation. As referenced earlier, Colombian submarines operated under strict energy constraints. Battery management dictated speed, depth, and endurance. U.S. systems accounted for this by simulating plausible decision trees based on known submarine behavior. When a theoretical model aligned with environmental data, confidence increased, not in location, but in intent. The question was no longer where the submarines were, but what they would be forced to do next. At this stage, control did not mean containment. It meant patience. Allowing the submarines to proceed created more data than attempting to block them. The longer they remained submerged, the more predictable their options became. Geography in the Caribbean Sea imposed unavoidable choices. Areas where depth dropped too sharply, regions saturated with sensors, zones where commercial traffic paradoxically reduced concealment due to acoustic consistency. Each constraint intersected with energy consumption, slowly transforming freedom of movement into a narrowing corridor. Inside the submarines, the experience was profoundly different. As noted earlier, there had been no immediate sign of compromise. Yet subtle pressures accumulated. Maintaining optimal depth required adjustments that consumed power faster than planned. Environmental systems worked harder than expected due to localized temperature anomalies. None of these issues were critical on their own, but together they shortened timelines. Decisions that had once felt flexible became irreversible. Turning back was no longer simply a choice. It was a calculation with consequences. Psychological strain emerged not from fear of attack, but from ambiguity. The crews were trained to react to threats, not to absence. With no clear enemy action, every internal warning felt hypothetical. Was increased power consumption a technical fluctuation or a sign that the margin for error was shrinking? Was silence above proof of success or evidence of something unseen? Information arrived in fragments, and without a visible adversary, interpretation became the real challenge. Meanwhile, U.S. forces began closing the loop, not through force, but through confirmation. Rotary wing aircraft deployed passive sensors in patterns that appeared routine, but were mathematically aligned with the most probable submarine corridors. These deployments were spaced widely enough to avoid detection, yet close enough to validate models. When multiple independent inputs converged, uncertainty dropped below acceptable thresholds. At that point, the outcome was no longer in question. Only timing remained. The final phase unfolded with remarkable restraint. Rather than cutting off movement abruptly, U.S. commanders allowed remaining options to degrade naturally. Routes that appeared open were, in reality, energetically unsustainable. Others required exposure to conditions the submarines could not afford. The crews began to recognize that every maneuver carried disproportionate risk. Speed increases threatened endurance. Depth changes compromised sensor effectiveness. Remaining submerged ceased to offer advantage. The decision to surface was not made under duress, but under clarity. It was the recognition that the operation had shifted beyond their control. No alarms sounded. No weapons were deployed. When the submarines broke the surface, the response was measured and procedural. Distance was maintained. Communications were formal. International norms were observed. The message was implicit but unmistakable. The encounter had been managed from the start. What mattered most was not the act of surfacing, but what followed. No escalation occurred because none was necessary. Control had already been demonstrated. The Colombian submarines remained intact, their crews unharmed, yet their strategic value had been fundamentally altered. As discussed earlier, a submarine that can be tracked without being attacked is still neutralized. Confidence, once lost, cannot be restored by silence alone. In retrospect, the operation revealed a shift that is easy to overlook. Modern naval dominance is exercised through structure rather than action. It relies on systems that function continuously, integrating data across domains and time. The decisive moment is rarely visible, and by the time it is recognized, it is usually past. For those involved, the lesson was not about technology or tactics, but about understanding where control truly resides.